Iraq is a country at war with itself. Week after week, militants connected to Al-Qaeda attack both Sunni and Shia communities in an effort to destabilise the national authorities and the country as a whole. And the British Ministry of Defence and its armed forces seem powerless to prevent it. The most recent incidents of violence occurred when Iraqi troops, backed by local Sunni tribesmen, were fighting militants connected with Al-Qaeda in Iraq's western regions, including Anbar province. Official figures estimate that over 1,000 people were killed in January alone. This makes it the deadliest month in Iraq since April 2008. And the death continues. Hundreds are killed by terrorist attacks in Iraq on a weekly basis. So how would Western citizens react if this carnage played out on a weekly basis in their streets and their cities? Do they feel those responsible for committing the West to this war should expect consequences for their actions? And what do they feel is Britain and America's legacy to that country? These are the simple questions we sought to answer. And we started by inviting the public to share their general perceptions and impressions of the Iraq people and the Iraq country 11 years after the invasion. Hundreds of people have been killed in recent terrorist attacks in Iraq. What's your current impression of that country, certainly since the 2003 invasion?
Well, I think it's messed up, and I'm not sure how much we helped it. It's easy in hindsight, of course, and I respect that we had to do something, or we felt we had to do something. It's going to be a long haul, and all we can do is try and be supportive, really.
I'm not really sure, because I think, to be honest, I get home on a night from work and I watch the news, and it just seems to be, it's so often now, you know what I mean? Every other day or every other week there's something happening somewhere, and you just accept it as the norm at the moment, and it's sad, you know what I mean? It shouldn't be happening, and, you know, like Afghanistan and all this, and, you know, where's it all going? I mean, look at Lee Rigby and all that, and it just escalates, one thing escalates into another, and it's sad.
I think it's in complete disarray. I think they've been completely destabilised, and they've removed power without putting something in place. And I think it's going to be generations before that's going to be solved.
It's really sad. It's devastating to see all the people going, but we're trying to help them and stuff. But it's hard at the minute as well.
So those were the views of the public. We turn to our experts for their assessment of the condition of Iraq since 2003.
I think the situation in Iraq is considerably worse than it was in 2003 when Britain and the United States invaded. Indeed, it's worse even than when the last British troops left in 2009. It's facing a humanitarian crisis in the western province of Anbar. According to the latest UN figures, in February alone, I think it's 860 people have killed, almost 3,500 people injured. If you extrapolate that on an annual basis, that means that 10,000 people are being killed still. Not only that, but my friends and colleagues, Iraqis who visit home now, tell me that the day-to-day life of people is absolutely awful. There's still electricity shortages, food shortages, difficulty with health, education and so on, high unemployment. The country's in a mess, to put it in a word. Very far from the democracy that Tony Blair promised us when he invaded.
Well, it's scarcely now, unfortunately, a single country. The Kurdish area has more or less gone from the control of the central government in Baghdad, and almost certainly will never come back. And warlords basically rule the roost over much of the country, especially and most toxically Al-Qaeda warlords, who have seized control of important cities and regions in Iraq, and either the central government in Baghdad, for fear of huge casualties on all sides, or because they simply can't be sure of the military outcome, are unable to take these districts back. And there's a group of people whose name tells you that they wish to make what they call an Islamic State out of a part of Iraq and a part of Syria, which is of course a sectarian statelet that they are seeking to create. And the carnage, as you describe, is simply horrific. If it were being shown on our screens every night, which it is not, then people would be saying even more sharply than they already are, was this what all that blood was shed for in invading and occupying Iraq?
We turn to quite a challenging question. We asked the public how they felt the West and Britain would react and feel if hundreds of people were being killed in terrorist attacks in London and in other Western cities.
If hundreds of people were killed in Britain every week by terrorism, how do you think the country would react? How would you feel about that if that happened in the UK?
Oh, there'd be uproar. There'd be, so many protests and, everyone would bind together and, stuff would be done. It wouldn't exactly go unnoticed. People would bind together and find ways of joining arms.
I think the country would be united. I think we would do our best to try and sort of support each other and sort of work together to I guess, resolve the issue.
Well, I think actually it would probably bring the community together better, for number one, and that's probably quite a random thing to say, possibly.
I don't think it would happen. That's the difference. And I think we also close an eye when it has to do with Middle East or that sort of part of the world where I think people got accustomed to it. It's quite brutal to say, but people, when you see explosions, cars explosions in street markets in the Middle East, I don't think no one gives it a second thoughts really about dozens of people getting killed daily just going grocery shopping. If that would never happen here, and yet we just don't really do anything about it or give it a second thought. It's become normality, which is quite atrocious, really.
So those were the views of the public. We invited our experts to share their views of the experience of terrorism in the United Kingdom and how the West would react in similar circumstances.
Oh, I think that's simple. I think it can be said in a word. We would see ourselves as being at war, and we would respond as if the forces attacking us had declared war on us.
If you look at the death toll in Iraq, both from the initial sanctions and then the invasion and the occupation and the sectarian strife which has inevitably, ineluctably flowed from the occupation, the death toll is some 2 million out of a population of around 22 million. The equivalent, therefore, in Britain would be 6 million dead people in Britain. Now, you just have to state that number to see how inconceivable, literally inconceivable. Even in the First World War, we didn't lose 1 million of our soldiers, and that was the worst disaster that we ever encountered. We'd have lost 6 million if we'd have lost as much as Iraq has.
Was the West aware of the likely effects of the invasion, the consequences of it to Iraq itself?
Do you think the West and Britain anticipated the results of the invasion in Iraq in 2003?
I don't think they realised what they were getting into. But the First World War, they didn't, did they? They sleepwalked into that. And you can sleepwalk into situations and suddenly realise that you shouldn't be in them. But by that time, people have died and it's a little bit too late.
I don't know. You'd think that the people that are making these decisions to go into these places are thinking about the after effects and the what's going to happen afterwards, but who knows? If they thought about it, did they take it seriously? Don't know.
Do you think that Britain and the British people anticipated the results that would ensue as a result of the 2003 Iraq invasion?
Probably not, no. I think they trust the government, obviously, and but I think, again, that's easy in hindsight. I think we felt we had to act, so no, they won't be happy now, though, absolutely not.
They might have a slight hint, but I don't reckon they were prepared for the devastation and stuff, so.
In a way, yes. I don't know if the public really knew and if we were given the right picture of it. maybe not. But I guess the politicians probably knew it. So it's, yeah, maybe. Some of us, the people who make the decisions probably knew it.
How accurately did we predict the outcomes of the 2003 Iraqi invasion? This is the perspective of our experts.
I think that there were certainly people like myself, although we were in a minority, who were following the situation closely. We knew, we had a clear understanding of what British aims were, and therefore we knew what the likely consequences would be. If you mean the British public, no, I think they were blissfully ignorant of the sort of state we were going to leave Iraq in. If you mean the British government, then I would say this is always a very contentious thing, and it's difficult to prove because you can't get into people's minds and read their motivation. But I would say that the British government had enough understanding and enough historical evidence to be aware that it wouldn't be a straightforward fight in Iraq, and that going in they would do the sort of damage that they have in fact done.
Well, I know that Tony Blair was, because I told him, not just repeatedly in public in the chamber of the House of Commons, but personally, man to man, face to face, many times. 5, 6, 7 times. On one particular occasion, the last one, not long before the invasion, I told them that the fall of Baghdad will not be the beginning of the end, it will merely be the end of the beginning. That there is no Al-Qaeda in Iraq, but if you and Bush invade it, there will be thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And that the Iraqis will fight the occupation, and then they'll fight each other, and the blood will never stop flowing. So I know that he knows because I told him.
Given the death and devastation in Iraq as a result of the invasion, and the fact that we've never found any evidence of the weapons of mass destruction which are used as a justification for that action, should there be any consequences to Tony Blair and the others who promoted the war on that basis? Here's the public's view.
Given the death and devastation in Iraq, and the fact that we haven't actually found any material evidence of weapons of mass destruction, do you think there should be any consequences to Tony Blair and others who used that as an explicit justification for the war?
Well, I think it's difficult to say. I mean, if you look at, I mean, the chemical weapons were used against the Kurds, and that was a fact. But going in, and there were lots of false claims, and there was lots of appetite to go in and maybe finish a job where they should have probably done it in the beginning, but I think that's caused a lot of animosity in it, and it probably wasn't dealt with at a political level first of all. I think it was a heavy-handed approach.
I think there should be. I think the result of not finding sort of the weapons of mass destruction that were originally sort of what we were looking for. I think there should be. I think a full inquiry, and I think those that are responsible should stand trial.
Absolutely. I mean, if to get to the core of what information they actually used, and understand, well, was that adulterated in some way? Was that slanted to help with a certain argument rather than being a basis for a decision being made on it? Absolutely, there should be. Yeah. Absolutely.
With no evidence of any weapons of mass destruction, should there be consequences to Tony Blair and others? This is what our experts think.
Yes, if there were any justice in the world, then Tony Blair and those members of his government that were directly involved would be indicted and brought to trial. Unfortunately, there's very few examples, if any, in history of that sort of justice taking place. So I'm not so sure it's likely to happen in the foreseeable future. But I think it's, by any standard, not just of justice, but basic decency. Not only did this man take our country to war, he's actually benefited, profited from it directly. And I think people find that very distasteful. He's reckoned to be a millionaire to the tune of 27 million. He's recently reported that he's going to be appearing in the Times newspaper's rich list, one of the top 100 richest people. And to add insult to injury, he's been made, when he resigned as Prime Minister, he's been made a peace emissary to the Middle East. I think most people think that is thoroughly disgusting and unpalatable. It's interesting, there was an opinion poll, a public opinion poll recently, and 1 in 5 people thought that Tony Blair should be brought to trial.
Well, I think John Kerry would nowadays describe it as invading a country on a trumped-up pretext, which is precisely what he's saying Russia is doing in the Ukraine, although not a drop of blood has been shed by Russian action in the Ukraine. Consequences must follow if justice and democracy mean anything at all. I'm making a movie called The Killing of Tony Blair. One of its principal goals is to try and get Tony Blair on trial for war crimes, crimes against humanity at The Hague in front of an international tribunal. And if we can't get him there, we might get him somewhere else. We have some secret plans in that regard. But these people, this is the main point. These people have not been held to account. They're still ruling the roost. Mr. Blair has made £75 million in personal gain as a direct result of the actions he took whilst he was Prime Minister of Great Britain. The other war criminals are still wandering around the House of Lords, around the corridors of power, around the corridors of wealth, as directors of companies, sometimes companies that directly benefited from the invasion and destruction of Iraq. So it's not just because we wish to see justice in this life, all of us, of course, will face justice in the next, but because if we don't hold people to account for the crimes that they commit, why should the next generation of leaders not commit the same crimes? After all, if what they see is just profit to be made from their actions in power and no punishment, no holding to account for the crimes that they commit, why should they act any different?
Can the public pinpoint any kind of legacy for Iraq from Britain and the West? Here's their view.
What do you think the West and Britain's legacy is in Iraq and for Iraq?
It's very difficult to tell what a legacy will be. A legacy is a thing that's going to take many years. At the moment, it's still a mess. It depends what comes out of that mess.
I think the idea and what everyone thought, hoped, not thought, was to leave a form of democracy behind. But I think it's the same old story. We've done it for centuries, well, thousands of years. I think going to a country as a foreigner and trying to establish your way of democracy never worked.
When I watch the news reports and read the articles and listen to what's being said, the general people of Iraq and the way the British Army have behaved over there, I think it's more positive than what we see being portrayed on the news. And anything that gives people freedom of speech and movement and behaviour and being able to let girls go to school, it's got to be a good thing in the long term. So I think it's generally more positive over there than what we actually get shown, apart from pockets where it's always going to be extreme views held.
What do you think Britain and the West's legacy is to Iraq?
Well, its damage has been done. It's like breaking your leg. Once the damage has been done, it's very difficult to heal it. So therefore, mistrust. What is the root cause, of course, of any war in the world is always political. Sometimes a little bit ideological, but 90% is political.
I don't know. I have no idea, actually, to be honest.
Do you think we leave a good or a bad recent history behind in Iraq?
Of course not. Look, just what happened in Africa 150 years ago when we started to get into politician issues down there, what that affected in the history of Africa after and the situation we left behind after us there. I think we should be very careful with what our business and the parts of the world that we don't really know what we're getting into in a way. we maybe mess it up more than we understand.
Finally, we turn to our experts again to give a personal and very honest account of their view of the legacy from Britain and the West to Iraq as a result of the 2003 invasion and everything that happened since.
It's a big question as well as a direct question. I think it's a big question because Britain already has a long history and a very unsavoury history in the Middle East and in Iraq in particular. I think that in immediate terms it will be remembered with loathing and disgust by the population, not only of Iraq but of the whole Middle East, because it played a very perfidious role in what's going on across the whole of the region. But in terms of its longer view, I think this will be seen as part and parcel of Britain's colonial history. Britain was the dominant power in the Middle East for a very long time. It had bases there. It's part of the British Empire. The troops that guarded the British Empire were stationed in the Middle East. And as people know, Britain's relations with the kings, the royal family of Iraq before the Nasser movement and the overthrow of the royal family there at the end of the Second World War, Britain treated Iraq as a client relation. The fact that Britain is still very deeply involved in the Middle East is an indication of the close relations, the imperious relations that have continued between America and Britain. So I think that that bodes very badly for the future pages of history, as well as evidently a loathing by the Iraqi population because of what we've been part of doing to people.
Well, in Shakespeare's Macbeth, Lady Macbeth cannot remove that damned spot, this blood stain on her hand, and she says, all the perfumes of Arabia will not expunge this damned spot. And I'm afraid for New Labour and for Britain as a state, this is a spot that will not out. It has poisoned the political system here. Nobody believes their government anymore, and they're right not to believe them. Even though sometimes the government is telling the truth, nobody actually believes them. On both sides of the Atlantic, the political class has been essentially hauled below the waterline so far as credibility and integrity is concerned. It's one of the reasons why we're not presently at war with Syria, because the public know that when we're being subjected to the drumbeat of war propaganda and marched off in the direction of gunfire, it's probably a bad idea and it's probably a pack of lies.
No weapons of mass destruction were ever found in Iraq. No lasting peace has been achieved. Indeed, Britain and America's illegal war in that country has left little more than a perpetual state of deadly and persistent violence. This is the legacy of the West's foray into that country, a legacy in which there are no winners, only degrees of losing.